Olá, boa tarde. Espero que estejam todos e todas bem. Meu nome é Rodrigo Duran, eu faço parte do comitê gestor do GIEC, sou parte do comitê de programa e você é um dos mediadores dessa palestra. A professora Tassiana Falcão será a nossa outra mediadora e realizará as traduções durante a palestra. É um prazer receber vocês aqui na primeira palestra do Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação e Computação, o EduComp 2021. O EduComp 2021 é realizado pela Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, a SBC, por meio do Grupo de Interesse de Educação e Computação, o GIEC. O EduComp 2021 está sendo sediado virtualmente pela Universidade Federal de Jataí. Hoje nós contamos com a interpretação simultânea em Libras feita pela Angelina Barbosa, da UFJ, e pela Nilza Lopes, também da UFJ. Agradecemos ao Núcleo de Acessibilidade e Inclusão da Universidade Federal de Jataí, que permite o nosso evento alcançar um grupo maior de pessoas com essa transmissão. Vocês podem interagir com comentários e perguntas através do chat do YouTube. A nossa equipe de apoio vai disponibilizar para mim as perguntas e os comentários aqui nessa transmissão de hoje. No momento da discussão, elas são incluídas na medida do possível. Você também pode fazer as perguntas em português, se assim preferir, a professora Tassiana Falcão, que vai realizar a tradução para a nossa palestrante. A palestra de abertura do EduComp 21 é intitulada The Prevalence and Relevance of Computer Science Education Research. Ela vai ser proferida pela nossa convidada, temos a honra de receber hoje a professora Colleen Lewis. A Colleen Lewis é professora assistente de Ciência da Computação na Universidade de Illinois, em Urbana-Champaign. Lewis era a McGregor Duran Associate Professor de Ciência da Computação no Harvard Mudd College, na Universidade de Califórnia, Berkeley. Lewis completou seu doutorado em Educação de Ciência e Matemática, seu mestrado em Ciência da Computação e a graduação em Ciência da Computação e Engenharia Elétrica. A pesquisa da Colleen Lewis busca identificar e remover as barreiras ao aprendizado de ciência da computação e como otimizar o aprendizado de ciência da computação. Lewis faz a curadoria do CES-Teachingtips.org, um projeto que visa disseminar práticas efetivas no ensino de ciência da computação. Lewis recebeu o NCIIT.org Undergraduate Mentoring Award e o AnitaB.org Emerging Leader Award por seus esforços em ampliar a participação em ciência da computação. Colleen, welcome. It's so nice to have you here today. Please, we welcome you here and thank you for accepting our invitation to talk to us today. We're really excited to hear about your perspective on computer and education research.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Colleen Lewis. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I hope that folks enjoy the talk. The slides are available. We can paste that link. And I look forward to your questions after the talk.
Gente, boa tarde. A Colleen está muito feliz de estar aqui conosco, está muito animada para esse momento. Então, ela falou que os slides do vídeo vão estar disponíveis depois, né? E que também após o vídeo estaremos aqui. Ela está ansiosa para participar da sessão de perguntas e respostas logo mais.
Obrigado, Tassiana. A nossa equipe de apoio agora vai transmitir o vídeo da apresentação pré-gravado da palestra. Nós adicionamos legendas autogeradas em português E vocês podem postar as suas perguntas no chat do YouTube e interagir com a Colleen Lewis através do YouTube ou no Discord. Ao final, nós vamos voltar para um breve momento de discussão ao vivo.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Colleen Lewis. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'm going to be talking about the prevalence and relevance of computer science education research. Again, I'm thrilled to be here. Okay, so before I dive into the talk, I want to give you some context and background about who I am. So I did undergraduate, born in the US, did all of my schooling in the US. So I did undergraduate at Berkeley in electrical engineering and computer science. After that, I worked as a software engineer, both at an IT consulting company called Capgemini, and then making educational games at a place called Leapfrog. After that, I went back to grad school, and in grad school, I did a joint program. So the structure of the program meant that I got a master's degree in computer science and a PhD in education and science and math education specifically. And the idea was to prepare researchers to research computer science education at the higher ed level. So I did that. After that, I worked at Harvey Mudd College as a faculty member for 8 years. Then my husband and I moved to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So they were interested in expanding into CS education research and expanding that research area that they had. And so I just joined the faculty there. As context, I have a project called csteachingtips.org. We try and document and disseminate effective teaching practices in computer science. You can see my team here. I've just been at the University of Illinois for a year, but I've been glad to be able to get to work with these fantastic people and these fantastic students. Okay, so my big picture in terms of how I approach the work is I am interested in making CS more accessible. This is my primary goal, and I try and do this through 2 methods. One is by trying to understand and optimize learning, and then the second one is trying to identify and remove barriers to access to computer science. Okay, so that's the frame that I'm taking and sort of the slice of CS education that I'm most interested. So throughout the talk, I'm going to try and give you the big picture of some CS education research, but just so you know, I'm going to be a little bit biased towards some of the work that I've done or that focus on making computer science accessible. Okay, let's dive right on in. So here I have a photograph of the programmers of the ENIAC computer. So this is what programming looked like in the 1940s. And what I think is really exciting is, 1, a lot has changed, and 2, we get to see and we get to be the people who decide the ways in which computing changes and transforms over the next 50 years. And so I think in that there's a big responsibility of deciding what computer science looks like and deciding who gets to participate in computer science. At the time of the ENIAC programming, only a few computer scientists were needed, realistically. And I think that has drastically changed, which makes computer science education specifically really, really important. So I think about it in these 4 big buckets of why we need to expand computer science education. 1, for CS innovation. 2, for CS work. So the people who are actually doing computer science work. The third piece is for folks who are engaged in some of this work using computation, but not computer scientists. And then lastly, the needs of citizens. So let's look at that. The first piece is related to CS innovation. This is a photograph or an image from Hank Levy in a 2020 presentation that he presented. And Hank Levy, as context, is the former director of the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. Okay, and so this is looking at this broad field of computer science and how much it is primed for impact and innovation across all this range of fields, and particularly that makes computer science innovation essential for societal impact. Okay, our next group of people is sort of typical computer scientists who are doing the work of computer science. So the National Center for Women in Information Technology, or NCWIT, that's a US-based organization, reports that in the US alone, there are going to be 3.6 million unfilled computing jobs by 2029. And right now, based upon the graduation rates within the US, we're only on track to fill 24% of those. And so we really need to ramp up production because there's this huge growth in this sector and our need for computer scientists. Okay, a third piece is these people who are engaged in work using computation. So I want to return to Hank Levy's diagram, and then let's gray out the center. So that inside part, that's the work that computer scientists are going to do in really pushing our field forward. But for the folks who are engaging with computer science in each of these areas, their work is going to become increasingly computational. Do they need all the courses and background the computer science major might need or that computer scientists might need? Likely no. But I think we're going to see an increasing number of jobs, and we're seeing this already, that require some computational skills. Okay, our last one, and I think this one's really important and often forgotten, is the importance of the needs of citizens. So, the world is increasingly computational, and just like every student learns about how digestion works and electricity, we need people to be able to understand computing and computer science to be able to understand the world around them. That's really essential for helping everybody understand how to interact online, say privately and securely. We need people to understand the ways in which companies collect and use data about them. And underlying all of this is some understanding of computer science and computing. So I'm really passionate about our need as a society to meet the needs of each of these sort of buckets of people, right? These innovators, the typical computer scientists, the CS plus something else, and then everyday citizens. And this is all supported fundamentally by CS education work. And so we are seeing a huge growth in CS education in response to the increasing needs in each of these buckets. And we'll dive into that a little bit, just looking at some of this evidence of huge explosion in CS education, because it's like an important place right now. Okay, to provide some evidence for this huge expansion of CS education, I'm going to run through sort of chronologically in the US some of what's happening in terms of that CS expansion. So we'll start with just some of the pre-readers. We've seen a huge proliferation of these tools to help pre-readers, kids who are too young to learn to read, to be able to program. We're also seeing a lot for that pre-readers in these physical objects that are creating. So I think these companies that are creating these are responding to this interest in general. Similarly, we're seeing a ton for those younger kids who do know how to read. One of the most common ones here is the programming language Scratch, based at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, developed at MIT. And they've got a ton of awesome resources for it. At the middle school level, so in the US, that's sort of like 10 to 13, we're seeing a ton of expansion of CS courses in those spaces. And they're often using what's called CS Unplugged. So it's trying to teach computer science topics and content and concepts without the use of a computer. So we're seeing the programming stuff like Scratch being integrated there too, but we're also seeing this huge explosion in CS Unplugged content getting integrated into schools in the US. Another sort of trend we're seeing in this CS expansion is the use of physical computing. So that takes often two forms, is like, one, you are programming something that has some physical manifestation, so like a little Arduino or the LilyPad or microbit shown here. And there's lots of cool sort of e-textile stuff where people are able to make clothing that lights up and sort of more tactile stuff. And then shown on the right is actually a colleague from Harvey Mudd College, Julie Madero, showing off some code that it then programs a sewing machine to be able to sew, that's integrated into a college level class actually at Harvey Mudd College. So we're seeing this additional explosion of resources and tools. Robots in computing education in the US are not super new, but I think we're seeing a lot more of them come out and hit the market. Then in early high school in the US, the main thing people are doing is a breadth computer science course designed at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. They designed a course to think about teaching CS topics or CS concepts and integrating that with inquiry. So helping students discover and ask questions about the content, and then equity, thinking really explicitly about, whose voices are heard and who has access and participation. Book I totally recommend, Stuck in the Shallow End, by Jane Margolis and colleagues, about that development of that introductory CS course at the high school level, and their research that supported it and motivated it. Okay, so this gets us to early high school. Another piece that we're seeing that sort of spans early high school and middle school in the US is integrating programming into other topics. So the original one, this is by Bootstrap World, integrating it into algebra, or now physics and data science. So we're seeing an expansion of those integration curricula in our schools. Moving up to mid-high school, in the US, we have the College Board, and they are a private company that runs tests for students to take that allows them to get college credit. And so recently they added a new computer science course called CS Principles. Again, this is a breadth course designed to be accessible to students across sort of this high school spectrum, and introduce them to how does the internet work? And, how does abstraction work in programming and things like that? And on this slide, I've just pasted the logos of a bunch of the different curriculum providers for that new advanced placement course, or this sort of college level course taught in high school. This one is longer standing, but we've had another College Board or advanced placement or AP course called AP CSA, not particularly creative. And that's really a Java programming course. Again, I've got some of the logos from some of the curriculum providers working in that space. So here I've walked you through like a number of sort of for me, evidence that there's lots of new things popping up in this space. We also have some numbers. So again, looking at that College Board courses, we see this as on the y-axis is the tests taken in thousands. And so these are, again, taken by high school students. And then it's got 3 courses on there. CSAB was an old version that they discontinued. CSA is the one, the Java programming course. And then CSP is that CS Principles course, that breadth course. And we're just seeing remarkable explosion in enrollment in this. And I think it's really interesting in particular to look at how CSAB was discontinued. That was a Java programming course that integrated more data structures content into it, and it was not popular enough, and so it was discontinued. And it's like, oh, they maybe didn't see 2019 coming. So we're just seeing this huge growth. Similarly, in the US at the college level, so the Computing Research Association is a nonprofit organization, and they commissioned this report, Generation CS, Computer Science Undergraduate Enrollment Surge since 2006. And I mean, the short story, maybe not surprising, we're just seeing huge surges in enrollment. So here they looked at 2005, 2010, 2015, sort of a snapshot of the average enrollment in an intro CS major course, a mid-level CS major course, and an upper-level CS major course. And this is actually just at Ph.D. granting institutions in the US. But we're just seeing huge growth. I recommend the report. It also compares it to, this is far above what we were at in the .com era, sort of early 2000s. So there is increasing interest. So I'm really excited about CS education, and across this grade bands, the pre-readers to college, I think all of that CS education infrastructure is supporting students and humans to be able to pursue anywhere from CS innovation to their needs as a citizen, their needs as an adult, to be able to navigate this increasingly complex computational world. Okay, so CS really supports all of that. And I think the thing that's really cool is CS education research underlies all of it. Like, how do we know if we're doing a good job teaching people for these varied goals? I think, what are the innovative ways that we should be moving this forward so that we can be more effective in how we're teaching people computer science for these various needs, and so that we can be more equitable in expanding who has access to learning about these different pieces, so that one segment of the population isn't left behind. So we really need to be focused on both that effectiveness and efficiency in our teaching of computer science and the equity of who has access. Okay, now we're ready to talk about CS education research in earnest. And so as context, I want to help describe how I think about CS education. I think of it, like other fields of education, as really informed by a bunch of different fields. I've pulled just three sort of dominant ones of psychology, cognitive science, and sociology. And so all of those both inform education practice and provide tools for doing education research. So I think that makes education in general a pretty cool field. The thing that I think is extra fun about computer science education research is that it also bridges from these traditional CS disciplines, so programming languages or PLs, human-computer interaction or HCI, or software engineering or SWE. And each of those have complementary findings, complementary research methods that all relate to humans and computers in one way or another. And really that interaction and education is a slice that you can think about, even if they're not using education in their publications in these computing disciplines. We can see real relevance to computer science education research, just like we can see that relevance with cognitive science, psychology, and sociology, etc. Okay, so CS education research, because it's pulling from education and these other fields more broadly, one role it has is in translational. So we actually know quite a bit about how people learn and how we can effectively teach them. And so then some of the work of computer science education research is testing that out and trying that out. What does this mean? What are the implications for computer science education? So I want to pull 6 examples that I think are pretty relevant and might be of general interest. And they're pulled from this book that I recommend, The ABCs of How We Learn. Just does a nice job of sort of summarizing some of what we know in general. Okay, so the first one is to provide spaced interleaved practice. Spaced, that part is pretty intuitive. It's more helpful to study over time and rather than the night before an exam. And if we could get students to recognize this, that would be amazing. The second piece, interleaved, is, when you study something on one day and then you go back to it the next day, it feels hard. Do you know what I mean? Because you have to recall all the stuff you were doing the day before. Well, here's the deal, is that interleaved practice is the idea that actually when it's hard like that, because you have to recall all the stuff that you had done the day before, the week before, or before lunch, that process of recalling it is really effective. So spreading things out, and then even when you're studying within a single day, interleaving your work so that you have to work a little bit harder to recall it. Okay, the next one is provide timely, specific feedback. Students and learners in general are trying to make sense of the world, whether that's your expectations for them, the new skills they're learning, these mental models, etc. And so the extent to which you can provide coaching for students with timely and specific feedback is helpful. Promote belonging in class. So the extent to which a student feels comfortable and like they have a place as a learner in the classroom actually correlates with a lot of important outcomes related to learning. And so that sense of belonging, or that sense of feeling like you belong, is really important for learning overall. Help students connect old and new information. So when we're teaching something, we're not just teaching it, we're helping students make sense of that new information in the context of their existing information. So our understanding is that our ideas in our head get connected to each other. That's something about the structure of our mind. And so we're kind of connecting it, sort of binding it to this old knowledge as a way of helping it stick. illustrate content with contrasting cases. So we all know from one single case, we might overgeneralize. And so the idea in this general principle is that we want to look across cases to be able to recognize their commonalities and their differences. Develop student skills with worked examples. So this one's, I think, really interesting, where in general, when they compare the learning that happens if you ask a student to solve a problem versus if you ask a student to read a solution to a problem, they learn more from reading a solution to the problem. I find it very counterintuitive, but when you're solving a problem, it's really hard. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot to manage in that problem solving process. And so when you read an explanation of a problem, you have the opportunity to be able to focus in a way where you're not overwhelmed with these sort of extraneous details. And some of this, depending upon your competence level. So if you are very, very expert in an area, and the example here is students who are studying to become medical doctors, they do better trying to solve the problem because they have such a rich set of knowledge. But for novices in a domain, they're better equipped to learn from examples of problem solutions rather than solving the problem themselves. Okay, so something hopefully some of that is interesting to you. The other thing I wanted to flag for you is some of this stuff is based upon literature in psychology, cognitive science, sociology, etc., that is not particularly new. But I think CS education research does do an important translational work of getting that content and those insights embedded into CS education. So on that last slide, you might have noticed that a lot of those were focused on the individual student. And at the 2020 main CS Ed conference in the world, ICER, there was a paper published by Yasmin Kafai looking at, and colleagues shown here, trying to help people think about these different levels of granularity that we might use in our research. So a lot of those were cognitive. So they're focused on the individual student. That's sort of the inner piece, individual student and their knowledge. And then you go expand out a level, and it considers the fact that students are learning in a context with other humans, and that actually those social connections and that peer interaction and interactions with the teacher, those actually make the learning of an individual much more complicated. And we can expand our focus to include that, to capture more realistic understanding of what's really happening. So there are strengths to the myopic focus on cognition, but if we want to think about generalizing into classrooms, we need to be thinking about students in communities. And then expanding out another level is problematizing or questioning what is the education for. And so this critical approach, taking its name from critical race theory in the US, at least that's my understanding of its original source, is thinking about computer science for what? And the answer in the critical frame is thinking about justice. So as we're looking back at who is doing computer science, whether it's CS innovators or the CS that people need for citizenship, and the CS that people need for citizenship is interlinked with not just their individual needs, but their needs to be able to interact with systems of power and systems of oppression within society. And so I think that critical lens, particularly as folks are needing to navigate the ways in which data is collected about them and how that data is used, I think is particularly relevant for us. Okay, so now I want to again tie us to how some education research has been informing really, for me, exciting and innovative approaches to CS education research. So the first example I want to pull from is in that cognitive space. Okay, so some early work in physics was looked at sort of misconceptions or persistent misunderstandings in physics. So there's a famous set of videos that was done at Harvard. So they've got Harvard graduates, in their fancy caps and gowns on graduation day. And they ask them some questions about why it is hotter in the summer than it is in the winter. And the real answer is that it's about the incidence of light. So if I have a light source that's directly hitting my hand, that'll be warmer than if I tilt my hand and fewer rays are actually hitting my hand. Okay, so that's the answer. But these Harvard graduates, that's not what they said. They said that the shape of the orbit of the Earth is that during the summer, we're actually closer to the sun. That was the explanation they gave. And it's just like, what? This isn't one of the premier universities in the US. And this is a relatively basic idea that we might get exposed to sort of young in primary grades, etc. Okay, so this one was really startling and to the community to be like, oh my gosh, what are we teaching people and how is it going? So sort of in line with this stuff of this idea that there are some ideas that are really hard to dislodge. And the idea that closer is hotter is sort of one of those. That's sort of easier to latch onto than sort of the incidence of rays of light. Okay, another one in this sort of space of what we call misconceptions is this study by Vosniadu and Brewer looking at kids' understanding of the shape of the Earth. And it sort of makes sense that when they experience the Earth, they're walking on a flat Earth. Do you know what I mean? Not saying that they think the Earth is flat, but when they walk to school, it's flat. And then people are telling them that it's shaped like a sphere or shaped like a ball. And so on here, you can see some of the composite images of how students are trying to make sense of their prior knowledge. I walk around and it's flat. It doesn't seem like a ball. And then this information that people are telling them that it's a sphere. And so this relates to the previous information, the previous idea of connect students' knowledge to prior knowledge and helping them do that integration, I think is really an important piece. And just the realization that some of these misconceptions are really sticky, are really difficult to dislodge. And so it, I think, makes the space of education research of what makes this sticky, what makes this hard for students, really interesting and fun. Out of this line of work where there's this idea of very, very sticky ideas that are difficult to help students address, came this idea of concept inventories. So in physics, what they developed, and you can see the reference here, is the force concept inventory. It's a set of 29 multiple choice questions, and the distractors or the incorrect answers on the multiple choice questions are super well designed. So here, here's just a snapshot of one of those questions. So someone's hold a ball on a string and spinning around, and then they let go. What will happen to that ball? And the answer is B, but many people say A. And what's really interesting is they can use this test with these very well-designed distractors, or very wrong, incorrect answers, as pre-post tests within their introductory physics courses or within an introductory mechanics course. As a way of seeing not just how are students doing on my on my exams and on those sort of problems that involve a lot of computation and other things like that, but how are we doing in terms of the underlying concepts? Are the sticky things that we thought were hard to teach, are we helping students actually learn that? So this has been really helpful and impactful in physics education as being able to be used as a benchmark for if you're trying to innovate in how you teach people, if you're trying to innovate in pedagogy, are you effective in doing that? And you can use these pre-post tests as one measure. A lot of really fun work, I think, in computer science, trying to replicate some of that work to say, what are the really knotty concepts and can we design studies to measure that? Okay, just as a simple example from some of my work is, here's in the programming language Scratch. I ask kids, when you click the green flag, how many times is the note going to play? And it says repeat 1, and then that middle block, play note 60, that plays middle C. And students will say, Colleen, it plays it twice. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's real wrong. It only plays it one time. But then they explain it to me, and they're like, Colleen, it plays it, and then it repeats it once. And it's just like, oh, wow, that's a very reasonable thing to think. And so I think it's fun because in physics, they don't get to design the rules of the game. They don't get to design which way the ball goes. But in computer science, we designed that repeat one would play the body of that loop once, or execute the body of that loop once. So I think it's an interesting space as we're bridging from physics education into computer science education research to think about how some of the dynamics change when we design the system. One of the early examples of these misconceptions relates to while loops. So in English, when we say while something, once it's not happening, while there are still potato chips left, once that becomes false, we stop doing the thing. And so the misconception that was found in the 80s was looking at, here's an example of a while loop. And the idea was that once X became 5, it would immediately leave the loop, just immediately. Whereas actually what will happen is it will execute the full body of the loop before going back up to check. And so students with the misconception would think that 5 would not be printed. But in fact, it would be. Okay, and so there's this huge line of these, and I think it's really exciting. We've got, this is just a wall of references, but the first one is a relatively recent literature review of some of these misconceptions and challenges of learning in computer science, specifically introductory programming. And then I've listed just a subset of the work we're seeing in CS. And you can see from the dates, they're relatively recent in developing these concept inventories, focus on the concepts and learning of particular slices of computer science. So I'm really excited about this sort of trend and innovation and how it can help us drive further innovation in CS education research, because it can provide some of these benchmarks for students' conceptual understanding. Okay, I want to zoom in into a bit more of some of this cognitive stuff. So really fascinating research finding. You can see here from the, it's actually reviewed in the 90s, but it's from before then. What they did is they gave expert chess players and then just random people who, didn't really know chess. They gave them board configurations of chess and asked them to try and memorize them. Okay, so look at them and then reproduce them after the fact. And what they found is if they gave people realistic chess configurations that might actually happen in a chess game, then the chess experts were just way better at it than random people. But if they gave random board configurations that sort of would never happen in a chess game, the random people, or the everyday people, and the chess experts were about the same at being able to reproduce it. And so the idea from this was that it isn't just that, one idea was that it isn't just that chess makes you better at everything. It's that chess experts develop chess-specific domain knowledge that relates to how these pieces are sort of laid out and their relationships between each other. And that domain knowledge helps people be able to solve more complex problems. And the big idea is that they are chunking it. That's the term they use. So instead of having to think about, all the pieces individually, they're thinking about chunks of pieces. And you can even think about this as relates to reading. So if we thought about words as individual letters, that would be a lot to store in our brain, but we can chunk them into words and their associated meaning. And using the chunk of words allows us to recall the individual pieces, but we're sort of our short-term memory isn't overloaded. So you've maybe heard the thing if you can remember 7 plus or minus 1 or 2 or something like that. I'm sorry to not remember it exactly. That's this idea of, what are the things you can remember? And it's these chunks, okay? And experts develop chunks specific to a domain. So I've been really excited about exploring this in my teaching and in my research. And so one thing I've started doing in my introductory Java class is requiring students to memorize some things that I think are chunks. So on the top, you can see a swap that swaps 2 elements in an array. I find students find this really conceptually demanding. Why do I need a temporary variable? Why this third variable? And so that one, and then the bottom one that loops through an array and just increments all the values at each of the indices. I require students to memorize these, saying, can I seed what these domain-specific chunks are that students are going to be learning about? For me, this connects really closely to how we're thinking about students reasoning about code. And there's some relatively recent work looking at what are called explained in plain English questions. And I'll add some references to the slide notes for this one. And these explained in plain English questions, it's looking at the idea of like, we often just ask students to write code, but if we're asking students to write code, can they read code? And not just can they read code line by line, but can they explain the big picture, sort of the overall picture of what's happening in that code? And in some of my work related to this, I'm looking at how students are using these physical models. So here is a physical model of an array, and you have to flip the sticky note back to be able to see the value. And there's a little tiny 7 written on there. And so this is representing the array, the written array shown at the top. And I've been really excited about looking at how students are solving problems where, as they're trying to trace through some sorting code using these sticky notes, it seems like the sticky notes are really helping them sort of abstract from individual lines of code to see the bigger picture, to see the purpose of the code and what it's doing. And so I think this is the explained in plain English is another recent innovation to check out. And it relates to me of this interest in abstraction. Seeing how students were abstracting in this interview using the sticky notes also connected me with some prior math literature. And the big picture of this from math is about abstraction. So the idea is we learn from concrete objects, and then we're able to recognize sort of pictorial versions of them. And as we develop and grow and learn as kids, we can abstract those. Like the fact that we see these 3 squiggles as representing the thing on the left, that concrete bus, I think is pretty impressive. Math educators have been using this very productively. And probably this resonates with some of how you learned, that we learn using physical objects, then pictures of objects, then this very abstract symbol, this little squiggle that represents a 3. And I think we don't always think about this idea of, like, on the right-hand side, 4 plus 5 as abstraction, but it really is. And if someone's having trouble with the abstraction, we can go back to the pictures. And if someone's having trouble with the pictures, we can go back to the concrete. And so it provides this beautiful learning trajectory. And then there's been a lot of great research about how this is really helpful for students learning, this concrete, representational, abstract sort of sequence where you can go back and forth. And I realized in my Java teaching that I was giving students the abstract version, that's the Java code, and the pictorial version. I was drawing memory diagrams on a chalkboard or a whiteboard, but I wasn't giving them that concrete version, which has been so effective in math instruction. And so my more recent research is looking at how can we create these physical representations. So here I've shown one with just some simple examples of Java using strings. So the picture on the left is before line 5 executes, and the picture on the right is after line 5 executes. And I've been designing these, what are called notional machines. These are explanations or strategies for helping students understand particular aspects of programming or programs. Yeah, I've been really excited about this. And I think in the future, what I see is that, math has all of these complex representational forms, these tools and strategies for teaching people primary concepts in mathematics. And in the future, I see us as sort of catching up with that and being able to embed those specific concrete practices that we find are effective and embedding those across computer science course contexts. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit and think about who is participating in computing. So Harvard Business Review frequently looks at, when you have teams that have people with a variety of identities on them, so sort of diverse teams, do those do better? And sort of study after study shows that diverse teams outperform racially or gender or another motivation for us one, we might want everyone, regardless of their identities, to have access to computer science. And then we also might want to be more effective in the computer science work that we do. And so I think both of those can motivate us to think about, like, wait, who has access? So there's really interesting patterns that we can see in the US in terms of women's participation in computing as compared to other fields. So you see from sort of the 1960s, 1970s, this gradual uptick in women's participation across a variety of fields. So here we have medical school, law school, and physical sciences. And computer science is tracking along with those right until around 1985. And you're like, well, what is causing this dip? What's happening in 1985? And there we can look at the ways in which stereotypes emerge as personal computers are coming out, they get marketed. And so what are the ways in which they're marketed? And what are the surrounding set of stereotypes that shape who computers are for and who computer science is for? A real go-to book around what happened in that 1985 that led to this drop in women's participation in computing in the US is a book by Nathan Ensmenger at Indiana University, The Computer Boys Take Over. It tracks that history and thinking about the ways in which media, advertising the personal computer shaped our current stereotypes. I want to run through some data about patterns of underrepresentation in the US. That's obviously going to be different in Brazil. This is some data compiled by the Kapor Center for Social Impact. They do a variety of diversity and inclusion work around computing and tech. So men in the US earn 82% of bachelor's degrees in CS, while women earn only 18%, and 20% are Black or Latinx. And in the US, Black or African American is one group of people that can overlap with folks who are Afro-Latina or Afro-Latino. And we refer to another group of people as Hispanic or Latinx. And Latinx is a thing in the US or some parts of the US to avoid the A/O binary, because not everyone identifies as a man or a woman. And so in the US, these two groups are overlapping. Someone can be both. And as a big picture, I think 38% of the US identifies as either Black or Latinx. It was one of those two. Low income students and students of color, and specifically here they mean Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, so Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, and Pacific Islanders. That's our group of Indigenous folks in the US. They are less likely to have, 12 times less likely to have access at their high school. Some more recent research from 2020 is looking across the US states who has access in their K-12 schools, primarily looking at high schools, so sort of 14 to 18. And they're finding, so here are racial categories, and the y-axis is the percent of students who attend a school that teaches computer science. And you can see the racial groups that we have on the US Census on the bottom. So we have Native American, Native Alaskan, as the least likely to have computer science at their school, Black or African American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, white, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders, and then Asian. And so based upon people's race or ethnicity, they are more or less likely to have access to computer science instruction. And that can help us see some of the larger patterns at the post-secondary level. Similarly, we can remember that advanced placement, that college board test that students took in high school to get college credit. We see really large gaps between men and women's participation on that exam. That exam requires students to either select male or female. So not everybody identifies as male or female, but that test forces that option. And you can see that we have some gains on the APCS exam in the US in terms of women's participation, but it has historically been quite low. One more piece, the income level. So the y-axis is, again, the percentage of high schools teaching CS. And the x-axis, what that's showing is the percentage of the families where the students are attending a school that are classified as economically disadvantaged. So, 0 to 24%, 25 to 49%, or in the far right, 75 to 100%. And you can see that income level of the students at a school, and particularly the representation of economically disadvantaged students, predicts a lower chance that their school is going to be offering computer science. Okay, so that was some of the demographic data that we have in the US, but like what are the nuts and bolts of how those demographics are produced? And in a handbook chapter in the recent Computing Education Research Handbook, my colleagues and I talked about some of these mechanisms that cause these patterns of underrepresentation that we see, but I want to talk you through some. And some additional reports that sort of help illustrate some of those pieces. So the American Association of University Women had the report Solving the Equation, looking at women's underrepresentation in computing. Talking about leaving is looking at attrition or people leaving STEM, science, technology, engineering, or math fields in college. And the differential rates of attrition, so more people leaving who identify as women, Black, Hispanic, or Latinx, or Indigenous in the US. Some additional research by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine looked at the sexual harassment of women in the workplace and in academia. And then more recently, the 2021 publication from the same organization about mental health in the academy and how that shapes who's persisting, who's encouraged, etc. In the US, there have also been tons of studies looking at the ways in which people's negative stereotypes about people are influence their evaluation of them. So the traditional study in the US from psychology is looking at sending out a bunch of resumes that are identical. And then just changing one piece on the resume, that's the name on the resume. And so changing the name on the resume shapes how people evaluate it. So to be more consistent with the stereotype. So here, Janet Garcia versus John Garcia, people are more likely, because there are stereotypes about women being incompetent and less intellectually able than men, people are more likely on average to rate this identical resume if it has a woman's name on it lower. And there's just tons of references and research showing this thing, which we call implicit bias. It's different than this explicit intentional bias. It's this implicit bias, this stuff that, means that we interpret people's behavior and people's competence based upon some of these stereotypes. One big piece to help us make sense of this is work by Carol Dweck. Some of the stereotypes are that men, say, are naturally good at computer science. And so Carol Dweck's work is looking at these ideas about ability. Do we believe it is a fixed, immutable characteristic, or do we believe it's something that can grow and learn? And when people believe that they can grow and learn, and it's not some property that they're born with, some geek gene, they tend to pursue more effective learning strategies. So it's important for us as educators, no matter what we think about ability within computer science, to encourage students to adopt what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, thinking that students, that they can grow, that their mind is like a muscle where they're going to learn things and persist through challenge. Some of my work actually builds on some of Carol Dweck's work. So here, my colleagues and I did interviews with introductory CS students at the UC Berkeley and the University at Seattle in their experiences in the intro course. And we found a student who reported, even my professor told us that some people are just born that way with that mental outlook that is compatible with CS. They feel it's so easy for them. Yeah, and he told the rest of the people that some of you will try, but some of you won't get it. And it's just that your mental outlook isn't made that way. It's something you're born with. You can't help it. And so it actually seems quite compassionate, do you know what I mean? That you shouldn't feel bad that you don't have innate ability in computer science. But this idea about innate ability within computer science is actually quite problematic in shaping who gets encouraged to participate, who gets seen as competent, like we saw in those resumes or CV studies. And so I think we should be thinking very critically about this stereotype in particular. Another piece of evidence that suggests that this stereotype is really important is they did a study looking at, on the y-axis is the percentage of US PhD students who identify as female, and the x-axis is they surveyed people about whether or not they thought the field required, innate brilliance or sort of aligned with that fixed mindset piece. And what they found was that there was a downward trend where the more people thought that a field required brilliance, the lower the representation of women we saw in that field. And you can think about this again in the context of stereotypes. Stereotypes shape who is perceived as having innate ability. In general, in the US, women are stereotyped as intellectually inferior to men and particularly less competent in mathematical fields like computer science. And so this is, again, really important because it's about who gets encouraged to participate in this. And then when they're doing it, who gets seen as a good fit for that and seen as competent. Back to the interview study I did with my colleagues at those two institutions, we also found that students were having challenges making sense of their identity in relationship to the stereotype of who does computer science. So what we found is for every dimension of someone's identity that didn't match the stereotype of a computer scientist, they had to provide some explanation, some work to explain why it was not a requirement of the field, but was just a pattern. So for example, as a white woman, and recall that in the US, computer scientists are stereotyped as white or Asian men. For the fact that I am white, that means I don't need to explain why that lack of fit, because it fits with the stereotypical identity of a computer scientist. But as a woman, that doesn't match with the stereotype of computer scientists being white and Asian men. And so I do have to explain that, well, it's not that being a man is necessary. It's not required. It's just a pattern. And so it's this extra work that we do when some dimension of the identity are dimensions of our identity. And again, this shapes who gets encouraged, what opportunities people have, and then how competent are they seen in those spaces once they're participating. All right. We're going to pop back to learning in this blended space with a focus on learning in collaboration and learning groups. So there's a big picture term called active learning, which is basically just used to describe anything that's not just lectures. So anything where students are doing anything other than just taking notes and listening. And there was a meta-analysis. So here they were looking at 225 studies, comparing active learning and sort of traditional lecture. And they found that students in the lecture-only section, so not the active learning section, had lower exam scores and were more likely to fail. And so they're seeing these sort of broad benefits of active learning, of having students try and apply what they learn in class. Some follow-on work was they compared the performance for two very heterogeneous groups. Students who did not identify as, one group was low income, students who identify as low income, Black, Latinx, and or Indigenous, so Native American, Native Alaskan, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, to people who didn't identify as any of those. And what they found was that there were gaps in performance. And they found that these active learning strategies address those gaps. So here they were looking at exams and pass rates, and you can see how many studies and how many students they were considering. And they found on average, active learning reduced achievement gaps in exam scores and pass rates. Active learning benefits all students, but offers disproportionate benefits for students from underrepresented groups. And those underrepresented groups they include are those listed A, B, C, and D. And so this active learning is seen from education, and specifically STEM education, not just as something that helps students learn and is productive for learning, but then provides additional benefits for students from groups underrepresented in computing. We see a really cool manifestation of that in some work called peer instruction. And I encourage you to check out peer instruction for CS. So peer instruction is a process of active learning where you give students a problem to solve. They solve it individually, and they use typically some kind of response system to indicate their answer. Then students have the opportunity to discuss it in their group and come to a consensus about what they think the answer is. You can imagine a lot of time, like a lot of peer learning can happen in those moments. And then everyone votes again, and then there's a class-wide discussion of that content. And actually that structures the whole of the course rather than a traditional mode of lecture. And they've found really impressive results. I haven't done any of the research on this slide, but I just wanted to run through some of them. So students appreciate it whether they're at small or large schools, early or late in their program. The results in in-class learning, that's where the learning is happening, reduces failure rates from the courses, improves exam performance, contributes to an increase in retention of introductory majors, and then provides data so that educators can see which students are struggling and trying to intervene to better help them. Tons of benefits, and this is sort of how this active learning piece has been integrated into CS and some of the unique CS education research that's taken place. I will plug one more time, csteachingtips.org. We've got tips for teaching computer science. We've got a bunch of short videos and PDFs and handouts and the searchable tip library. Check it out there. And then I will close. I just want to say one more time that I think there's, it's a good societal investment to focus on computer science education research. We looked at all the different people who need access to some knowledge of computer science, that all relies on CS education. And to really realize the potential of CS education and have that be both effective and equitable, I think we need to be doing the underlying CS education research to support it. Thank you so much for having me. The link to the slides is there, and I hope you go and check it out and pull any references that you'd like. Again, thank you so much.
Olá, estamos de volta. Que impressionante essa palestra da Colleen Lewis. Lembrando que vocês podem continuar interagindo nos comentários, fazendo perguntas através do chat do YouTube. Nossa equipe de apoio vai disponibilizar para mim as perguntas e os comentários aqui na transmissão, ok? Então, agora nós vamos convidar o professor Colleen Lewis para responder as perguntas. Colleen, time flies, really, really flies when you're having fun. It didn't look like we were just 1 hour watching the presentation here. It is my 5th time already, so it was really amazing. So what an amazing summary of computing education research. So let's hear what our audience questions, okay? I think we start with Professora Mirella. Mirella está perguntando, o site do CS Teaching Tips é realmente perfeito. Tem algum plano para que a gente possa traduzir essas dicas do site? Porque seria muito útil, nós poderíamos ajudá-la a traduzi-los para português, por exemplo.
That's a wonderful idea. Thank you. I am excited to translate them to Portuguese, but don't know Portuguese. So maybe send me an email. It's colleenl@illinois.edu.
Então, a Colleen achou a ideia fantástica. Ela não sabe português, então, claro que ela precisa de ajuda. Então, quem tiver interesse pode entrar em contato com ela no e-mail, que a gente vai disponibilizar depois. E ela adoraria que isso fosse feito.
Ok, ótimo. Agora nós temos uma pergunta da professora Silvia, né? Muitas pessoas ingressam no curso de computação pela motivação que recebem na educação básica, por exemplo, com projetos de robótica, Scratch, Technovation Challenge, mas um choque muito grande no primeiro ano, né? Depois que eles entram nos cursos de computação. Acho que tem um pedaço a mais da pergunta, se a gente puder continuar. Só um instantinho. Tá, eu tenho aqui o resto da pergunta. Olha lá. Alguns docentes universitários não reconhecem essas experiências que os alunos tiveram anteriormente como computação. Como lidar com esse conflito?
So, Colleen, Sylvia is asking, her question is about how many people go to computer science courses because of the motivation they received during their basic education, so high school, middle school. So, for example, projects involving robotics, Scratch, Technovation Challenge. But then in the first year, they have kind of a shock because some of the instructors at the university, they don't recognize this kind of experiences as computing. So how can we deal with this conflict?
Thank you. I think that's a good point. And in particular, we find that encouragement in these early years is particularly important for women.
É particularmente importante, inclusive para mulheres, esse encorajamento nos primeiros anos.
When students get to college, I think you're right that people say that's not real computer science. I think that general attitude is a big problem when it comes to creating inclusive environments. and I think relates to the discouragement you're describing.
Quando as pessoas chegam na universidade, realmente tem muitos professores que não reconhecem essa experiência que elas tiveram no ensino médio, no ensino fundamental, como computação. E isso faz com que essas pessoas se sintam menos incluídas também. É um fator que vai contra a inclusão efetiva de mais pessoas, como as mulheres, como ela citou na primeira parte da fala.
There are still real challenges because how we decide to teach computer science in college might not build off of what students learned before that. So it might be that what they have learned does not directly help them. So there may still be some truth to it, but I think it's important to help students recognize that they were doing computer science and to challenge our colleagues who classify things as not real computer science.
Por outro lado, a forma como a gente ensina a computação na universidade, muitas vezes é muito diferente desse tipo de projeto na educação básica. Então, existe uma certa verdade na questão de que aquilo não era computação, olhando por esse ponto de vista, de que são uma natureza muito diferente, né, da forma como se ensina uma coisa ou outra, e aí, de certa forma, realmente não seria computação as experiências anteriores, se comparadas com as experiências que eles estão tendo na universidade. Mas isso é algo que precisa ser melhor repensado, né, e trabalhado.
And thank you for the question. I think challenging the definition of real computer science and being inclusive about what we count is important for creating more space for people to join computer science.
Então, a gente precisa repensar o que é que a gente define como essa verdadeira computação, né, para que a gente crie espaços mais inclusivos para as pessoas em relação ao que é e o que não é computação, e ela agradece a pergunta.
Great, we certainly agree. So, para a próxima questão, Pasqualini. So, amazing talk, Colleen. What model to teach CS to young people do you think it's more appropriate to achieve equity? The one used by schools like the Quest to Learn in New York, we have the continuation, through outreach programs, or even training teachers without a major in CS to teach topics related to it.
Colleen, I will ask you just 1 minute so that I can translate to Portuguese, because also we have the sign language translation, so I need to speak it out in Portuguese. Thank you. Então, a pergunta de Pasqualini é que modelo seria usado para ensinar ciência da computação para jovens, né? Qual modelo seria mais apropriado para ensinar a ciência da computação para jovens? O modelo usado nas escolas, como Quest to Learn, em Nova York, através de programas ou treinamento de professores que não são formados em computação para ensinar tópicos relacionados.
Thank you. I think out of school options are very tricky because then they will only be available to students who have that access and are encouraged to participate in those programs. And we know that parents might be less likely to encourage girls to participate in CS classes outside of school.
Os programas fora da escola, eles são muito importantes para que se atinja mais pessoas, né? E pais e mães, eles tendem a não encorajar tanto as meninas a participar desses programas quanto os meninos.
I really think supporting teachers to learn how to integrate computer science into their classes is the way to go so that it happens during the regular school day. I personally worry about the use of robotics because they're very expensive and they may not be a good use of money for schools that already are lacking sufficient funds.
Então, visto por esse lado, né, de que nem todo mundo vai ter acesso a esses programas fora da escola, ela acha que os programas dentro da escola regular são mais efetivos. E ela acrescenta que ela se preocupa bastante com uma ênfase grande em robótica por causa do custo dos materiais, muitas vezes em escolas que já não têm um orçamento para cobrir o básico, né? Então fica mais difícil trabalhar com robótica.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next one, please. A professora Tassiana Falcão está perguntando: feedback é super importante, mas como lidar com a quantidade de alunos? Muitos professores não conseguem dar feedback de qualidade em tempo hábil de forma que facilite a aprendizagem.
So yeah, I asked myself this question. So it's about feedback. So you mentioned feedback as a very important teaching method, and I really agree with that. I'm really interested in this feedback aspect, but on the other hand, how can we do this? How can we provide timely and quality feedback when we have very large classes?
Here it is nice that we're computer scientists because some of our courses are using programming where there's more immediate feedback. And so that is not the case in math or English. So I think some of it we get for free.
Uma parte do feedback a gente acaba ganhando de graça, digamos assim, por estarmos trabalhando na área de programação, por exemplo, em que o feedback é automático. Podemos trabalhar com feedback automático. Então, se usarmos esse tipo de abordagem, a gente já consegue, né, de certa forma, prover esse feedback para os alunos.
In my own teaching, though, I also like to add opportunities for students to collaborate so that they're getting feedback, so they can review each other's code or even have the opportunity to see each other's code or see each other's problem-solving process as a way to learn from them and be able to provide feedback.
Quando ela está ensinando, ela gosta muito de criar oportunidades de colaboração entre os alunos, para que dessa forma eles possam ver o código um do outro, avaliar o código um do outro, às vezes até mesmo ter acesso ao processo de resolução de problemas que o colega está usando, e dessa forma aprender a partir da interação com os colegas.
Ok, great. So nós temos a nossa próxima pergunta da Ayla Rebouças. Como promover o senso de pertencimento dentro da classe, como nós temos 50 alunos, por exemplo, dentro da classe, e eu vou até estender. E quando nós temos 1.500 alunos dentro da sala?
I think you read the question.
I think we can think about what promotes belonging by flipping it and say, what makes people feel like they don't belong? And I think a first one is saying that's not real computer science.
Então, ela está falando que, às vezes, as pessoas podem achar que não é uma computação real, né? E aí, por isso, eles acham que não pertencem.
One thing I think about is when students raise their hand in my class and they show off. So they ask a question way outside the scope of the class. How do I respond? If I respond very positively and have a conversation that only they understand, I think students who can't understand what we're talking about will feel like they don't belong.
Quando um aluno, digamos assim, quer se amostrar, né, e faz uma pergunta bem fora do escopo, assim, digamos, um pouco avançada, né, faz aquela pergunta sofisticada, todo orgulhoso, então, como é que a professora vai reagir, né? Se ela reage dando muito incentivo e motivando muito aquele aluno, elogiando muito, pode ser que outras pessoas que não estão naquele nível de compreensão, né, porque está bem fora do escopo daquele momento de aprendizagem, se sintam diminuídas e tenham a sua autoestima abaixada por conta de não estou entendendo absolutamente nada do que está sendo conversado ali, então tem algum problema comigo, né?
So what I do is I will say, wow, that question is not something I would guess anyone else would understand. And don't worry if that question didn't make sense. And we can talk about it after class. You can come up. And so try to be very clear with students about my expectations for them, that I assume you have taken the required course that happens before this one or whatever, and I only expect you to know that. And I design the instruction for you and not for people who had a lot more experience.
Então, a forma como ela reage geralmente é dizer, nossa, uau, essa pergunta é uma pergunta complexa, né? Acho que é difícil entender essa pergunta. Então, ela deixa claro que aquela pergunta está fora do nível de exigência, né? Ela se oferece para conversar em outro momento com a pessoa sobre aquelas questões, e ela tenta deixar muito transparente para os alunos que o que ela exige ali naquela disciplina está relacionado aos pré-requisitos daquela disciplina, então o que é necessário para fazer aquela disciplina, né, e não a tantas coisas externas, assim como quando outros estudantes trazem para dentro da sala de aula, né, para não desmotivar a turma.
Thank you for the question. I'll add one more thing, which is sometimes students will say sexist or racist things in class or in the labs, and I need to talk to my students about how they might respond. For example, in the US, it's very common for women to be told that you only got the job at Google or Microsoft or Facebook because you're a woman. And having everyone in the community think to challenge that idea of what makes you say that can be helpful.
Uma outra coisa, primeiro ela agradece desde já pela pergunta e ela gostaria de acrescentar uma coisa, que muitas vezes são ouvidos, né, na universidade, comentários racistas ou sexistas, né, e também a reação da professora a esse tipo de comentário é muito importante para combater o preconceito, né. Então, um exemplo que ela deu é quando uma mulher consegue um emprego na Google, na Microsoft, por exemplo, no Facebook, e aí houve comentários do tipo, mas você só conseguiu esse emprego porque você é mulher. Então, a forma dos professores também, né, do corpo docente, combaterem esses comentários e reagirem a eles, né, para quebrar esse tipo de preconceito é muito importante.
Ótimas perguntas. Vamos à próxima pergunta agora, do Roberto Bittencourt, né? Ótima apresentação, Colleen. Ótimas ideas para explorarem inovações educacionais. Mas a pergunta é, como lidar institucionalmente com a adoção de inovações educacionais dentro da universidade? Nós sabemos que muitos professores não se importam tanto com essas inovações e continuam ensinando os seus cursos da forma que eles vêm fazendo por um longo tempo, né? Então, como tratar com essa mudança?
I think a problem in how education people talk to other faculty members is we say, change everything you're doing. Absolutely everything. And that might not be realistic. So I think as education people, we need to help people see, this semester, make these small tweaks to your class. Next semester, maybe make these small tweaks to your class. So I think we need to see educators as iterative improvements rather than full replacements. But I think often we tell people they have to replace everything, and I wouldn't want to do that either.
É um problema com quem trabalha na área de educação, né, ou pesquisa nessa área, ou é formado nessa área, muitas vezes, é que existe uma tendência de chegar para professores e dizer, você precisa mudar tudo o que você está fazendo, né? E aí, esse tipo de atitude leva os professores a ficarem na defensiva e a rejeitarem aquelas mudanças, porque ela própria diz que ela não gostaria, de repente, de mudar tudo que ela faz em sala de aula. Então, o processo precisa ser incremental, né? Chegar para os professores com pequenas sugestões do que é que eles podem mudar, então, dar dicas de, olha, faz esse ajuste aqui, muda isso aqui, né? E, aos poucos, quando o professor pode fazer mudanças pequenas, fica mais viável de, aos poucos, ele ir melhorando sua prática docente.
For example, I think we could have faculty pause in the middle of class a few times, and it doesn't add more work for them, but might be better for students. Additionally, we could have them make small changes to their homework assignments to be more explicit about how students should get started on the homework and what they should learn. There's recent research called transparent teaching that says that one is helpful. And thinking about changing strategies for how we respond to these show-offy questions, I think can be helpful. As small changes, not make 1,000 hours of videos.
Três coisas que ela aconselha, né, baseadas em pesquisa. A primeira é que os professores poderiam fazer pausas durante a aula. Ela diz que isso não é um trabalho extra para o professor e ajuda muito os alunos. A segunda é que na hora de passar atividades, tarefas, né, para casa, para fora da aula, deveria ter uma orientação de como o estudante pode começar aquela resolução, né, começar a resolver aquela atividade, né, uma orientação inicial ali, e também as expectativas, né, inclusive isso é ligado a ensino transparente, ela chamou, né, de como, o que é que o professor, qual a expectativa do professor, né, para o desempenho do aluno naquela atividade. E o terceiro, que eu esqueci, Colleen, can you repeat the third one? I forgot.
Discourage students from showing off during class.
Yeah. E o terceiro é não incentivar que os estudantes tenham uma postura muito exibicionista nas turmas, né, para não causar aquele problema que ela mencionou antes.
Ótimo, excelente. Agora a gente vai ver a pergunta agora do Jonathan, eu acredito, correto? Isso. A gente tem uma perspectiva cultural de ver o ensino como uma carreira menor. Como a gente quebra essa ideia errônea, né, entre a população, principalmente, mas também entre o corpo docente, principalmente aqueles que estão fazendo pesquisa, que ensinar é menos importante e para pessoas menos qualificadas?
I think an important source of the negative views we have about teaching relate to sexism. So in the US, education is primarily seen as women's domain, and women are seen as intellectually inferior to men. That's the stereotype. And so I think our attitudes about teaching are interrelated to that.
Ela acha que as nossas atitudes em relação à profissão de professor estão muito ligadas ao preconceito sexista, né? Porque ensinar muitas vezes é ligado às mulheres. Então, a carreira docente, né, principalmente na educação básica, é uma coisa de mulher, né? E por causa da visão de que as mulheres seriam intelectualmente inferiores aos homens, isso acaba, digamos, contaminando, né, a impressão, a visão que as pessoas têm sobre a carreira de ensinar, porque elas trazem esse preconceito sexista sobre isso.
I think a second piece in colleges and universities is this expectations for research faculty to get grants and devaluing of teaching. So I recently moved from a very small school with only undergraduate students that was very focused on teaching to an institution that cares primarily about research.
Uma outra questão que ela coloca em relação às universidades é que existe a expectativa de que os docentes, né, vão conseguir financiamento para pesquisa. Então, existe esse foco muito grande em fazer pesquisa, que acaba desvalorizando o ensino. E ela recentemente se mudou de uma universidade que era muito focada em ensino para uma universidade que é muito focada em pesquisa.
And I find that now I have new pressures on me. At my previous job, I prioritized giving undergraduate students research opportunities. In my current role, I need to do a good job of supporting my Ph.D. students. And so actually, I don't plan to work with undergraduates because I need to make sure that I'm meeting the responsibilities that I have. And it is very strange to deprioritize teaching or try and have teaching take less of my time. But I think there is a real conflict where I need to sleep and I need to have a life and I can't just do more and more and more.
Então, o que ela fazia antes, ela trabalhava muito com alunos de graduação e ela fornecia a oportunidade de pesquisa a esses alunos, né? Como aqui a gente tem a iniciação científica. Ela focava muito nisso. E agora ela está sentindo novas pressões em cima dela, que é a pressão da produtividade científica. E aí ela está dando muito mais atenção aos alunos de doutorado, porque eles têm uma maturidade, né, de produção científica muito mais alta do que um aluno de graduação. E ela admite que ela não está planejando mais trabalhar com pesquisa com os alunos de graduação. Ela acha estranho ter que, digamos assim, dedicar menos tempo ao ensino para poder atender às expectativas da universidade de produtividade de pesquisa. E ela diz que também ela não tem condições de atender tudo isso, de continuar se dedicando tanto ao ensino da graduação e ao envolver alunos de graduação em oportunidades de pesquisa, ao mesmo tempo em que ela consegue atender às expectativas de produtividade, porque ela quer ter uma vida, ela quer ter né, poder dormir, comer e fazer as atividades dela, né, da vida pessoal dela, independente da profissão.
However, even if I need to spend less time teaching now, I still can play a role in advocating for the status of teaching, that understanding and valuing that as important work, that and where every faculty member should be continually improving in their teaching, even in small ways.
Mas, por outro lado, o que ela continua fazendo muita questão de fazer é de fazer a propaganda, né, incentivar que as pessoas se dediquem ao ensino de qualidade, busquem um ensino de qualidade, né, e que é importante, né, tanto é que ela própria faz pesquisa nessa área de educação e computação, então ela continua levantando muito essa bandeira, né, sobre a qualidade de ensino, a importância da gente se dedicar a isso.
Ok, eu vou fazer um comentário nessa pergunta, que aqui no Brasil, às vezes a gente não tem muito clara essa distinção entre pesquisa e ensino dentro do da nossa descrição do nosso trabalho, né? Mas a gente tem cada vez mais no exterior, as vagas, né, não tenure, mas que eles são seguras para ensino, propriamente dito, dentro das universidades de pesquisa. Então, eu queria saber da Colleen o que ela vê sobre isso. Colleen, just a small question to you. How do you see this trend, this increasing trend, particularly in computing education, that we have teaching tracks with job security, for example, in Toronto and in other universities? Do you think that they can add to this quality of teaching without harming research? How do you see this new trend in computing education?
I am very excited about the new trend of respecting teaching enough to create jobs that focus exclusively on it. Teaching is hard, and we should let people specialize in teaching because they'll do a better job. There's still a tension that folks who are valued only for research also teach. But I think students will learn more if we hire more people who are passionate and committed to teaching.
Ela acha uma ótima ideia que haja vagas dedicadas ao ensino, porque ela acha que, para os alunos, eles vão aprender muito melhor de pessoas que são apaixonadas por ensino, que querem se dedicar a isso, né, e que vai ser muito proveitoso. E que existem conflitos e tensões, né, com pessoas que são muito focadas na pesquisa e têm essa obrigação, digamos, de ensinar também, e acaba não sendo um ensino tão proveitoso.
A problem I see, though, is when teaching faculty are still required to get grants or to write papers in CS education conferences, because if we value teaching, we should value teaching, And if that's what we hired them for, we shouldn't make them do other things, I think.
Porém, ela diz que muitas vezes essas pessoas que são contratadas para ensinar também são cobradas a escrever artigos, publicar em congressos, às vezes até conseguir financiamento, e para ela isso é estranho, porque se a pessoa foi contratada para o ensino, e isso é uma demonstração da valorização do ensino em si, não deveria haver essa cobrança da produção científica.
Ótimo. Agora a gente vai ter espaço para mais uma pergunta do Roberto Bittencourt novamente. Então, a Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, no seu currículo de referência para o ensino fundamental, sugere ensinar estrutura de dados, de recursão, desde o ensino fundamental. Quanto desses conceitos deveriam estar no ensino fundamental? A gente deveria ensiná-los usando computação desplugada, né, por exemplo, ou nós deveríamos realmente ensiná-los usando essas ideias formais, né, formalizar esses conceitos para esses alunos?
So first, the question of unplugged or without a computer, or plugged or with a computer. I don't know much about very young students and when it's appropriate for a student to start using a computer a lot. So that part, I don't know.
Primeiramente, ela quer pontuar que ela não tem muito conhecimento sobre a idade em que a criança, o que seria adequado para a criança começar a fazer atividade no computador. Então, ela não vai comentar sobre isso de desplugada, né, que é sem o computador, ou plugada com o computador, em relação à faixa etária.
However, I think in every grade, students need to learn about conditionals and loops to be able to understand the world around them.
Porém, ela acha que em qualquer nível de ensino, as crianças, os alunos deveriam aprender sobre condicionais e laços de repetição para poderem compreender o mundo à sua volta.
I also think they need to understand how to interact on the internet privately and securely.
Também que eles deveriam aprender como navegar na internet de maneira privada e segura.
And I think they need to understand the ways in which companies and the government collect data about people and use that data.
E também eles deveriam compreender como os governos e as empresas coletam dados de navegação e como eles usam esses dados.
So I think they need these 5 things, and I think they need them every year because they are really important, and I think they should push other content out so that students can interact in this computational world.
Ela acha que isso precisa ser reforçado a cada ano escolar e que, se necessário, substituir algum outro conteúdo para que os estudantes sejam expostos, né, a desenvolver esses conceitos.
I think this base level for citizenship, for every human needs to know these things, is more important than for preparing future computer scientists.
Ela acha que isso forma uma base para a formação cidadã, né, para a vida mesmo cidadã, muito mais do que uma preparação para estudar computação na universidade.
No, I love computer science, and so I like the idea of integrating data structures and recursion, but I am also a very practical person, and so I can imagine that it is more helpful to integrate spreadsheets like Excel that people are more likely to be using,
Embora ela ame ciência da computação, e ela é uma entusiasta de ensinar as crianças sobre recursão, sobre condicionais, mas ela também é uma pessoa muito prática. E, do ponto de vista prático, ela acredita que é mais útil para a maioria das pessoas aprender a usar softwares como Excel, planilhas de dados, que é mais provável que elas precisem usar isso, que uma quantidade maior de pessoas precise usar isso, do que aprender sobre, por exemplo, estrutura de dados.
Ótimo. A gente tem a próxima questão agora, do Elson de Paula. Parabéns, Colleen, pela palestra. Um dos grandes problemas que temos para a inclusão e retenção dos grupos mais vulneráveis da computação é, em parte, pelo baixo desempenho em matemática desses alunos anteriormente, né, antes de entrar na universidade. Como que a gente resolve esse problema?
So, congratulations for your talk. One of the biggest problems that we have for the inclusion and retention of groups that are more vulnerable in computer science is in part caused by the low achievement in maths during basic education and at university too. So how can we solve this problem?
I think that is a tricky one. I think there are a few approaches. One is to provide more mathematics support in college. UC Berkeley has a good example of this, where they offer supplementary collaborative sessions for students to better prepare for calculus.
Essa pergunta é difícil. Uma das coisas que pode ser feitas é cursos de reforço na própria universidade, né? Ela citou o exemplo da Universidade de Berkeley, que oferece um curso, oferece sessões colaborativas, né, para ajudar nesse embasamento matemático dos alunos.
A surprising finding that we have in the US is when students enter college without math preparation, they do not do better if they are enrolled in a remedial math class. This would make it longer for them to graduate, and they're not more likely to graduate if they take a remedial math class.
Ela disse que tem um achado surpreendente de pesquisa nos Estados Unidos, de que quando estudantes que chegam à universidade sem um embasamento matemático adequado são colocados em um curso de reforço antes deles entrarem no currículo propriamente dito, então eles têm um tempo, quando eles entram na universidade, primeiro eles fazem esse curso de reforço, isso não leva a uma melhoria no desempenho deles, porque isso vai prolongar o tempo deles para se formarem, e não foi identificada uma melhoria no desempenho deles, apesar desse curso.
I think we can also revise how we teach computer science to rely less on some of the mathematics contents. That seems positive. I found when I was teaching Big O or algorithmic complexity, students would say, I don't understand. But if I just waited to introduce logarithms, then they said, oh, I do understand this. And so the logarithms seemed to be the problem, and I could build their understanding of algorithmic complexity without it pretty well.
Ela acha que é possível também abrir mão de algumas das fundamentações matemáticas no ensino de computação. Então, ela citou o exemplo do logaritmo, que os estudantes tinham muita dificuldade para entender, que ela usava para explicar a complexidade algorítmica, né? Mas ela disse que ela consegue ensinar complexidade algorítmica sem necessariamente ter que entrar nos detalhes do logaritmo. Então, que os alunos conseguem entender melhor e que o problema na compreensão, na verdade, vinha de um entrave aí com o conceito de logaritmo.
I found when I worked as a software engineer that I was mainly writing conditionals and loops, and a lot of the mathematical content that I loved in college wasn't particularly relevant, but sometimes we have ideas about real computer scientists also know physics. That's a common one in the US. And so I think challenging some of our notions about what real computer scientists know maybe will also help.
Ela, quando trabalhava como engenheira de software, ela disse que ela basicamente o que fazia era escrever condicionais e laços de repetição, e que todo aquele conteúdo matemático, que ela até gostava muito durante a graduação, não aparecia no trabalho dela. E que talvez a gente precise também repensar o que é que um verdadeiro, né, entre aspas, verdadeiro profissional, um verdadeiro cientista da computação sabe ou não sabe, né? Então, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos existe uma ideia de que cientistas da computação sabem também muito de física, né? É uma ideia comum. Então, a gente repensar assim, esse estereótipo do que é que o cientista da computação realmente sabe.
Okay, unfortunately, our time with Colleen is coming to an end. I'm pretty sure that if we have more time, I could spend the whole afternoon talking about it, and I have so many questions. But of course, we can still talk with Colleen on Discord, and you can contact her later. The presentation and the slides will be made available for you. Colleen, on behalf of the EduComp attendees and the EduComp steering committee, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm pretty sure that everyone enjoyed a lot. So please, everyone, let's thank you, Colleen. Okay, thank you, Colleen. If you want to say a few ending remarks.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was a real treat.
Ok, muito obrigado. Estamos chegando ao fim da transmissão da palestra 1 do Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação e Computação, o EduComp. Foi um prazer estar aqui com vocês durante a tarde. Agradecemos novamente a Colleen Lewis por ter participado conosco das suas reflexões, resultados da sua pesquisa, onde certamente enriqueceram o nosso evento. Foi um prazer estar com vocês. Agradecemos também a todos que estiveram com a gente assistindo a transmissão dessa palestra e todos que colaboraram com seus comentários no chat. Agradecemos novamente o Núcleo de Acessibilidade e Inclusão da Universidade Federal de Jataí por ter enriquecido a transmissão com a interpretação simultânea em Libras feita pela Angelita Barbosa e pela Nilza Lopes. E continue conosco no EduComp. A gente vai ter um break agora, aproveite o intervalo para interagir com a comunidade no Discord. Obrigado, Tassiana. Até a próxima atividade, pessoal. Um abraço.
Tchau, pessoal. Boa tarde.
Amigos do primeiro Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação e Computação, que está sendo promovido pela SBC. Eu sou Laércio Correntina, cantor, compositor, filósofo, e eu quero cantar para vocês aqui uma canção chamada Esteta, que foi feita em homenagem a um pensador alemão do século passado chamado Theodor Adorno, que era um grande esteta, ou seja, alguém que observava o mundo sob a lente da arte. E essa canção, exatamente por isso, foi feita em homenagem a ele. Então vou cantá-la para vocês aqui agora. O mundo visto de lado a lado de uma lente que não é comum. A qualquer tempo, tempo imaginário, em qualquer lugar ou em lugar algum. Quando a roda gira, o inverso do fim de todos os deuses do Dasein de mim. Há que se dizer que a alegria é a inverso do fim de todos os deuses do Dasein de mim. Há que se dizer que a alegria é absurda e a palavra é muda. A lente aponta o sol de outra ordem, onde meio já não tem o fim. De bagarote quando tudo pode e onde o Papa não deixa mentir. É quando o trem da vida brilha, trilha e samba em Berlim. Pra todos os homens, abraços, abraços de mim. Há que se convir que a alegria é o espanto, mais que todos os santos. Porquanto o homem for a medida de todas as cores do mundo, toda beleza se perde no outono, em todas as coisas, no fundo. Esteta vai, esteta sai do fundo, esteta vela, alegria do mundo. Esteta vai, esteta sai do fundo, esteta vela, alegria, alegria do mundo. abraço para vocês.
Faz muito tempo que eu não escrevo nada. Acho que foi porque a TV ficou ligada. Me esqueci que devo achar uma saída e usar palavras pra mudar a sua vida. Quero fazer uma canção mais delicada, sem criticar, sem agredir, sem dar pancada. Mas não consigo concordar com esse sistema e quero abrir sua cabeça pro meu tema. Que fique claro, a juventude não tem culpa. É o eletrônico fundindo a sua cuca. Eu também gosto de dançar o pancadão, mas é saudável lhe dar outra opção. Os meus heróis estão calados nessa hora, pois já fizeram e escreveram sua história. Devagarzinho eu vou achando o meu espaço e não esqueço das riquezas do passado. Eu quero a bênção de Vinícius de Moraes, o Belchior cantando como os nossos pais. E se eu quiser falar com o Gil sobre o Flamengo, e o que será que o nosso Chico tá escrevendo? Aquelas rosas já não falam de cartola, e do Cazuza te pegando na escola. Tô com saudade de Jobim com seu piano, do Pixinguinha sempre acariciando. Se o Renato teve o seu tempo perdido, o João Gilberto quase sempre tão querido. A agonia do Oswaldo Montenegro ao ver que a porta já não tem mais nem segredo. Ter tido a sorte de escutar o Taiguara e a Madalena de Van Lins, beleza rara. Ver a morena tropicana do Alceu, Marisa Monte me dizendo beija eu. Beija eu, deixa que eu seja eu. Beija eu, deixa que eu seja eu. O Zé Rodrigues com sua casa no campo levou Geraldo pra cantar no dia branco. No chão de giz do Zé Ramalho eu escrevi. Eu vi Lulu, Benjote, Mai e Rita Lee pedir ao Beto um novo sol de primavera. Ver o Toquinho retocando a aquarela. Ouvir o Milton lá no clube da esquina cantando ao lado da rainha Elis Regina. Quero sem lenço documento Caetano e o Djavan mostrando a cor do oceano. Vou caminhando e cantando com Vandré e a outra vida Gonzaguinha o que é. Atenção DJ, faça a sua parte, não copie os outros, seja mais smart. Na rádio ou na pista, mude a sequência, mexa com as pessoas e com a consciência. Se você não toca letra inteligente, fica dominado ilimitadamente. Faça refletir, DJ, não se esqueça, mexa o popozão, mas também a cabeça. A cabeça. A cabeça, a cabeça, DJ. A cabeça, a cabeça, a cabeça, a cabeça, DJ. A cabeça. Passeio. Um segundo poderia revelar tudo que eu queria, agora era um sonho. Por um segundo eu só queria lhe dizer, eu queria era lhe dar um presente. A gente sente quando vem e é paixão, a gente sabe se é tesão ou brincadeira. A gente sente quando vem e é amor. O que eu queria era de qualquer maneira. de qualquer maneira. Uma hora eu queria lhe esquecer, eu queria nem saber o que eu quero. A semana poderia nem passar, mas eu espero ver você no domingo. Por um instante eu só queria estar aí, mas eu queria era arranjar um motivo. A gente sente quando vem e é paixão, a gente sabe ser mais forte que a aventura. A gente sente quando vem e é amor. O que eu queria como se fosse loucura. Como se fosse loucura. A gente sabe quando nem é ilusão, a gente sabe se é tesão ou brincadeira. A gente sente quando vem e é amor. O que eu queria como se fosse loucura. Como se fosse loucura. Eu queria nem saber o que eu quero. A semana poderia nem passar, mas eu espero ver você no domingo. Por um instante eu só queria estar aí, mas eu queria era arranjar um motivo. A gente sente quando vem e é paixão, a gente sabe se é tesão ou brincadeira. A gente sente quando vem e é amor. O que eu queria era de qualquer maneira. Como se fosse loucura. A gente sabe quando nem é ilusão, a gente sabe se é mais forte que a aventura. A gente sente quando vem e é amor. O que eu queria era de qualquer maneira. Como se fosse loucura. 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 Se vocês quiserem fazer a percussão conosco aí, nas palmas, fiquem à vontade. Por favor. Sim. Que beleza, hein? Manda 6. Se você faz a música ouvir, se você faz a música cantar, se você faz a música tocar, se você faz a música confundir, se você faz a música pra comover, se você faz a música pra incomodar, se você faz a música pra esquecer, se você faz a música pra conquistar, se a música faz parte desse universo, o universo todo dessa música é nada. Se você faz a música pra dançar, se você faz a música pra ficar parada, você faz a música fingir, se você faz a música esconder, se você faz a música mentir, se você faz a música mostrar, se você faz a música pra vender, ou se essa música foi feita pra dar, se você faz a música pra esquecer, se você faz a música pra emplacar, se a música faz parte desse universo, o inverso todo dessa música é nada. Se você faz a música pra dançar ou ficar parada. Correntino. Assim, na percussão. Olha lá. Assim, agora. Se você faz a música ouvir, se você faz a música cantar, se você faz a música tocar, se você faz a música confundir, se você faz a música pra comover, se você faz a música pra incomodar, se você faz a música pra esquecer, se você faz a música pra conquistar, se a música faz parte desse universo, o inverso todo dessa música é nada. Se você faz a música pra dançar, se você faz a música pra ficar parada. Parada. Agora sim. Se você faz a música fingir, se você faz a música esconder, se você faz a música mentir, se você faz a música mostrar, se você faz a música pra vender, ou se essa música foi feita pra dar, se você faz a música pra esquecer, se você faz a música pra conquistar, se a música faz parte desse universo, o universo todo dessa música é nada. Se você faz a música pra dançar, se você faz a música pra ficar parada.
Obrigado, gente.
Simbora, rapaziada. Quero ver vocês cantando conosco nessa salada musical brasileira da melhor qualidade possível. Simbora. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser cultural. Se você não Gonzaga, eu Azevedo. Se você não Buarque, eu Caetano. Se você não Pascoal, eu Canibal. Se você não Antunes, eu Lenine. Se você não Normal, eu não Cigano. Se você não Fulano, eu Zé Ninguém. Imagine a canção que não existe, ilumine o cantor que ainda existe. Se você não Farofa, eu não Alpiste. Se você não Filé, eu Zé Mané. Se você não Elisa, eu não Dolores. Você não Djavan, eu Trem das Cores. Se você não Ariana, eu Macalé. Se você João Gilberto, eu não Arrigo. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser cultural. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ter música boa. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Oh, yeah. Zequete, eu não Cartola. Se você não Escola, eu não Errei. Se você não Noel, Vila Isabel. Se você não Nascimento, eu Lamartine. Se você não Carnaval, eu Fevereiro. Se você não Setembro, eu não Baleiro. Se você não Palavra, eu não Proponho. Se você não Betânia, eu não Poesia. Se você não Jobim, eu não Carinho. Se você não Quintana, eu não Bacana. Você não Passarão, eu Passarinho. Se você não Verão, eu não El Ninho. Se você Gilberto, eu não Arrio. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser cultural. Emílio Queiroz. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ter música boa. Imagine que perigo esse Brasil ser musical. Diz aí.